Hello everyone, I'm Luke, and after the last video I was a bit sick of programming, so I decided to relax a bit by doing something simple, such as adding my own character to Unreal Engine to replace the default mannequin. Let's get right into it. First, I'll need to create my own character to put it into the game. I want a stylized, low-poly character that allows me to use a bunch of expressions for the dialogue. But there is a tiny problem. I suck at art. Yes, all art, except maybe music. When it comes to drawing, painting, coloring, or even handwriting, I'm so bad at all of these that every single line I put on paper is basically a crime against art. Of course, I could become a decent artist with years of practice, but I'm making a game right now. I don't want to wait years until I can finally draw something that at least resembles a human. Of course, at that point, most indie devs would go to an asset store, but I hate asset stores with a burning passion, although that's a rant for another video. So how does someone who's bad at art create models and textures for their game? Well, my dear viewers, there are two simple solutions: clever design and ethically questionable practices. When making assets for my game, I'm taking every shortcut, cutting all corners, and using each underhanded trick available at my disposal to create a fun and entertaining game. In fact, a few core decisions regarding the game were made with this approach in mind. You may think I'm exaggerating, so let me give you a few examples. 1. I chose 3D because models are easier to make than drawings. It may seem counterintuitive, but 3D models are actually easier to create than 2D drawings, at least for me. I use Blender for modeling, and it allows me to control each vertex of my model separately, so I can drag it little by little until it finally looks good enough for me. Drawing doesn't give me that option, even with many tools that drawing software like Photoshop offers. 2. I chose Unreal Engine because of Lumen and Niagara. They were about 30% of my decision to use Unreal Engine. Lumen is a lighting system that basically allows me to completely skip shading my models, especially in 3D, while still giving me the option to create good-looking lighting. And Niagara is a particle system that allows me to easily create fairly good-looking visuals. There's no way in hell I could imitate these systems by myself, and last time I checked, Unity was lagging behind with both lighting and particle systems. 3. Art style. Art style is very important for a game, and I chose a simplistic, low-poly chibi art style, because it is relatively easy to make and optimize. Of course, I wish my games looked even better than Elden Ring, but with my current skill set and resources, I'm happy if they look better than Pong. A pastel chibi art style requires only a few textures, as it is heavily stylized and doesn't need to be realistic, while still allowing for very nice scenery. And now let's get to how I created my character. First thing I did was look at a bunch of chibi models online. Then I recreated simplistic versions of parts from these models in my own Blender file, and then I adjusted it to fit my artistic vision better. The model has very few polygons, and generally speaking it's not too great, but it took me almost 20 hours to get it to that point, and it is the best I could do with my meager skills. Then I created some clothes by duplicating the original model, scaling it up, deleting some vertices, and then adjusting the shape slightly. Then I created the hair by creating some curves and changing their shape. Creating the hair that way was surprisingly simple, and it actually looks pretty decent. And so we came to the part that I feared most: the face. At first I wanted to create a 3D face by adding objects to serve as eyes and mouth, but every time I tried, it looked shit. I was forced to create 2D textures that I could put on my character. At first, I used texture painting in Blender to create a texture that would allow me to tell where the eyes and mouth should be, and here's what it looked like. I decided to create eyes and mouth textures separately, and then combine them into a single texture for each face. The eyes were the most difficult part. To draw them, I got a bunch of reference images into Photoshop. Then I traced lines over them to combine their elements into my own eye outline. This process actually has a name. It's called tracing, and it's considered disgraceful by artists, but I lost my dignity when I started working for a mega corporation, and I'm not a real artist anyway, so I don't care. I filled in the eye and added the iris and the pupil. I also added texture to the irises by overlaying some concentric lines on top of them. I created a few more expressions, but they won't come into play during this video. I slightly altered the eye texture for Ben. He's supposed to have a tired expression and dead eyes. Then I put the texture on top of a plane I put in front of Ben's face. It's set to mimic the texture's color and transparency, which gives me the complete face. And that's pretty much how I created faces for the characters. Of course, Ben still has to go through some upgrades to prepare him for the final release, but for now we'll proceed with Ben 0.3. Anyway, to animate Ben, I copied an armature from an abandoned project of mine, because doing the same thing twice is for losers. Then I created some animations. I'm not very happy with them, but they'll do for now. After creating the animations, I was ready to import it into Unreal, only to be greeted by blackface. So, it turns out that Unreal Engine completely disregards all material settings except the base color. After finding the problem, it only took a few minutes to fix most errors, so we can finally proceed to the fun part. Creating the basic movement and animation logic to go along with it was very easy, thanks to the default mannequin coming prepackaged with those things already. So all I had to do was copy and paste a few blueprint nodes and change a few settings in the animation blueprint, and voila! Our character is ready, and all it took was a few minutes of blatant thievery. Of course, this is just the beginning. The first thing we have to do is change the default settings in the character movement section. The default settings might be okay if you're trying to create an RPG with a realistic character, but for highly stylized platformer, using the default makes for a floaty, unresponsive, and not very enjoyable player movement. So, after tweaking settings such as ground friction, gravity force, and jump and movement speed, our character feels much better. At this point, the movement system is technically ready, but this isn't a government contract, so we'll have to do more than just the bare minimum. Let's face it, the movement looks shit. For highly stylized games, character actions should have quite a bit of flair to make the game fun. But how do I do that when my artistic ability is slightly below that of an average 3-year-old? Particles. Unreal Engine comes with Niagara Particle System, which is wonderful. It lets you create beautiful looking visual effects, and most stuff is done by nodes and math rather than actual artistry, so it's right up my alley. So let's add some particles. Using a tutorial in a language I do not speak, I created a nice poof effect, and then customized it to my liking. I want it to be a cloud of dust, which is created every time the character lands. So I attached it to the landing animation, so that the particle system is launched every time the animation is played during player landing. And boom, the movement already looked better. To make it even better, I also added a small poof and a few vertical lines to the character on jump. Sometimes in platformer games, you need to make small precision movements, so I also added walking, by simply setting the maximum movement speed to 1/3 of its usual value, anytime the player holds down the control key. Unreal Engine detects the speed and automatically blends walking and running animation. And the last thing I added was a dash, which will be important for both platforming and combat. The animation isn't the best, but I have no idea how to make it better, so instead I added even more particles. The dash has the poof effect copied from jumping. It also has a trail of lines and leaves behind a few hanging particles. With all of that, the player can only see how bad the animation is when looking from the side. There's a big possibility that I'll change the particles before the final release, but for now I'm quite happy with the result. And so, in a short span of time, my game went from having a default mannequin and floaty control system to having a custom, stylized character complete with particle effects that automatically launch based on the character animations. Launching the particles that way gives me a very responsive system that requires very little maintenance thanks to the animation blueprint. At this point, I decided to add two more things, just to add some extra flair on top of what I already have, and hopefully make the game a bit more enjoyable for the player. First was adding idle animations. In my opinion, having animations play when the player is inactive adds some personality to the game and the player character. So, I did my best to create two idle animations. I added them to the animation blueprint, and now a random one of them plays automatically whenever the player is inactive for 10 seconds. The second addition was cel shading. Basically, it just changes the way models react to lighting, from realistic to simplified. This type of lighting works well with stylized games and is quite popular among indie developers. Unfortunately, Unreal Engine's lighting system Lumen absolutely hates cel shading and creates atrocious lighting artifacts on large cel-shaded surfaces. I solved that issue by making it so that only my characters are cel-shaded, just like it's done in Genshin Impact. The game is still very far from being complete, but with the dialogue and movement systems done, it is slowly shaping up into something playable. Now we just need a few platforming elements before attempting level creation. But that's a topic for another video. See ya!